You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm excited to bring you another artist interview. My guest this week is Jason deCaires Taylor, who has been making underwater sculptures. That's right, sculptures and museums underwater for us to explore not only the beauty of nature, but also to contemplate the fragility and the way that maybe we as human beings could live in harmony with nature, and these systems could be symbiotic. But we'll get into all of that a little bit later. I'm really excited. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me, Jason deCaires Taylor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you on the show.
I am really excited, and this is actually like the perfect time to have you on the show because I want to tell listeners you are working on a new piece that you are planning and currently raising funds for. And so for any listeners who find this work to be interesting, I would encourage you to check out the links in the show notes. I'm not only going to include links to photographs of the work and all of that, but also some links for how you can help bring these amazing sculptures into the world. But the first thing I want to get into, Jason, if you wouldn't mind, I always find origin stories really interesting. I feel like stories are how we make sense of the world and art more broadly. Can you tell me, just to start, a little bit about your background? Like, how did you get into art and sculpture to begin with?
I haven't got a very normal background. It's pretty eclectic. I was very fortunate. My parents were teachers, and they sort of moved around the world teaching in different countries. So by the time I was 15, I'd lived in many different corners of the planet, and I'd been exploring all these amazing places underwater from quite an early age. After that, I went to art college, learned about sculpture. Also came from a family that had a lot of artists in, sort of it kind of progressed from there. It was a bit of a unusual start. I worked on public sculpture at art college, so worked in lots of different environments, public squares, outdoors, forests. But in the back of my mind, I always had this sort of experience with the underwater world and thinking, I've been underwater and looked at it from an explorer's point of view and looked at nature, but I really felt that it had never been explored from an artistic point of view. And maybe some of the portrayals we had of the sea, some of the iconography around it, and some of the sort of depictions of it were, based around fear, and I kind of wanted to maybe change that narrative a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting. So if I could tease that out a little bit, there are a couple of things that I'm picking up on there. So it sounds like you had an interesting exploration in your childhood going around the world, but then you said you went to school for sculpture. And as you studied sculpture in school, you said you were drawn to public art, public sculpture, work in public spaces. Were you using traditional media, and, were you taught more classical, traditional, more conceptual bent to it? Like, what was your educational background like? And, how did that lead you into displaying work outside of, say, the gallery and museum context?
I think that came about because I spent about 4 or 5 years being a graffiti artist and painting trains and tunnels and doing pieces outdoors. So I kind of maybe always associated art with being outside. And I love the sort of physicality. I was quite fortunate when I went to art college. My first day, I walked into the studio and the teacher was like, right, the one thing we absolutely ban in this art college is desks and chairs. It's a big empty hall, and we don't want you to think on a desktop scale. We want you to think about the space that you're working in. And that was pretty instrumental, early on. Basically, I'd hated working on the floor because it hurt my back. So I always wanted to make things bigger and try to fill the space. And yeah, I think that was an important lesson I learned early on.
It's interesting because when you think about it, the placement of the piece is almost a part of the dialogue of the artwork itself. It's not just what is sculpted, what the positive and negative space are, but also where it's installed can bring some new meaning to a work.
Massively. I think it's, yeah, like you say, it's a symbiotic relationship, and I think is vital to the understanding of the work, where it's placed.
And so that was really a part of your artistic process and journey. It sounds like almost from the beginning. And so then I am just dying to know, what was that moment where you thought, hey, I'll put this, on the ocean floor. I'll put this, underwater. And how did that go the first time you tried it?
I mean, I've been snorkeling and diving for a long time, and I sort of have seen how objects were changed and colonized, and the textures of coral, the skin of a sponge, all the various sort of elements that are underwater. How the light changes, colors change. Again, the viewer is in a very different state of mind. They're weightless. They're can move in a three-dimensional space rather than being subject to gravity. So, all these different elements, and I kind of always wanted to explore that at art college, but I didn't really have the sort of means and resources to be able to do that. And there was still a sort of missing element of, maybe a sort of practical reason. I didn't feel I was missing something. And then it wasn't until later on, when I sort of started working in the diving industry, that I realized that the sculptures could also have a sort of conservation benefit as well. They could not only grow coral reefs, they could provide habitats for marine life. They could draw tourists away from fragile areas. They could, yes, help control tourists so they didn't have any sort of negative on the environment. And so once I started to realize that, I sort of realized that, that was something that I really wanted to devote my attention to.
You're also apparently someone who doesn't shy away from a challenge, because I just think about the logistics of all of that. And you describe it as exhilarating with all these opportunities. And I am just thinking of, I would be so terrified of all of the different things and points of failure potentially in that. The material, for one thing, I have to imagine that you have to be selective in the material that you're choosing because of, one, how it's going to potentially decompose or affect the environment around it, what's going to stand up to the elements and what's going to work with the elements. But also, I can't even wrap my head around, how do you physically install the work without damaging a piece? Because if I recall correctly, you're working with concrete that's probably specially formulated, but then just the mass of that sculpture and installing that and doing no harm along, how does this all work? Can you walk me through that?
Sure, yeah. It's generally all a complete nightmare. It's very, very hard on many different levels. First of all, obviously, like you mentioned, it's very, very important, the materials, so that they're all environmentally sensitive, that they last for hundreds of years underwater, that they actually promote coral and marine biomass to actually adhere to it. That they're very strong, that we can lift them, so they're not too heavy that we can transport them, but heavy enough that they stay on the seafloor, because the power of water is much more intense than say the wind on land. So there's tons of engineering and working out how we're going to transport the sculptures, how we're going to fix them to the seabed, how we're going to get a crane floating on the water and lowering it down, and then obviously the team of people who are, commercial divers that are trained, insured, and experienced enough to be able to work underwater. There's all the permitting that goes into it. With each government, there's a different permitting procedure. And that's very, very different if you're in Australia to the Caribbean to the USA to the Mediterranean. So there's all of that side to it. And then there's also, there's all the sort of practicality of it. But then at the core of it, you're maintaining that you're still keeping the artistic integrity of the work, that it's still conveying its message. You're still able to evolve the design. You're able to reflect changes in, the duration of the project. Some of the projects can, take several years. So yes, it's quite a process from start to finish.
It sounds like it. And honestly, as much as you've named, there are still so many things that I am just dying to ask you about. So after a short break, we're going to get deeper into the weeds on your process, if you don't mind, or I guess deeper into the underwater equivalent of the weeds. I want to ask you a little bit more about the logistics and get your insights into maybe a specific piece of yours. So now you've talked a little bit about all the different things that you have to consider when creating one of your sculptures. But, as a admittedly less accomplished artist myself, I am curious about just your process of creation. So the first question that I'm going to ask you is do you start off with a concept in mind that you want to explore? Do you start off with, a look at the environment where it's going to go and then react to that and build the piece around where it's going to be installed? Can you just walk me through your ideation process?
Sure. So that again, it depends a little bit on how the project's initiated, whether it's myself approaching a public body or someone coming to me and asking for a piece of work. First of all, obviously the most critical point is that it's going to enhance the environment that it's going into. So you have to pick a site that there will obviously be no negative environmental impact on, that you'll actually be adding something that's beneficial. So we do lots of surveys to make sure that, it has there's not too much wave energy, that the substrate is flat, that there's no existing, coral reefs or other marine protected areas that we'd want to disturb. So once we've then got the site, it's very important for me that the work is connected to the location, is connected to the community that live there. And so from that process, I'll then start to sort of generate a concept or an idea. And from there, there's lots of different methods of the sort of making. So I initially used to do a lot of live casting. So I would move my studio around the world to different places. So, I've up to move to Mexico, to the Caribbean, to the Canary Islands, to Europe, been to Australia, Maldives. We set up a temporary studio. So lots of logistics in sort of moving families and staff to these places. And then I do a lot of live casting, so we'll get people to come in, volunteer. There'll be plaster cast in an alginate. From there's molds made of it. And then from an alternative ways, we also do scanning as well. So we now scan objects and people and places, and then those get sculpted into a initial form, and then that form is then molded, and then once we have the mold, we'll put in the marine concrete that goes to make the final piece.
I absolutely love the fact that you are using local people from the area as the models for your sculptures. I think that's a really cool element that you're bringing into it. And so you said you're doing a lot of stuff where you're making molds and then it's it's concrete poured into the mold. And then to install it, what does that look like? Is it a crane plunking it down into place? Is it a team of people, divers, like, slowly, trying to, because I just think you're talking about clearly tons of concrete there. It's not like you can pick it up and carry it yourself. Even in water, it's going to have some mass.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, again, it varies on the scale of the project and a lot on the budget of the project. But I think some of the smaller works, we've lowered off the side of a jetty and then lifted them up with a float, and then towed them out, and then I've sort of lowered the float so they rest on the seabed. And especially when I first started, I used to do a lot of stuff manually myself, and then with teams of volunteers, and we would float things out and assemble them all underwater and connect them underwater so that they all, they then had enough structure and weight to maintain themselves. But it was a lot of work, and it would also mean I was, underwater for weeks at a time, which was quite hard. So now I must say I use cranes much more. So there'll be a crane on a floating barge or on a boat, and that will lift the piece onto the boat, and then when it gets to the site, lower it over the edge, and that's a lot easier. And especially, I think the heaviest sculpture I've made is about 180 tons. Some of the currently working on one at the moment in Japan, which is around 50 tons, which is pretty heavy, and we have to transport it to Japan. So it's being sort of broken up into segments, and these segments will all sort of fit together and then, comprise this final piece.
And so then after it's installed, the piece really, that's where this gets interesting to me, because after it's installed, you make these so that sea creatures will do the heavy lifting on adding a patina and bringing color and those other elements into it. Like, they put the finishing touches on the work, which is something I find really fascinating. It kind of reminds me almost of like Smithson's Spiral Jetty, where, the piece went underwater and then it came back and it was encrusted in salt, and just, nature takes its course and it becomes a participant in the artistic process. Can you just explain for listeners, like, your thought process and in how you conceive of that and what you want us to recognize about that, physically, environmentally, symbolically, all of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly think, that is the sort of core essence of the work, how it changes, how it's ephemeral, how it's constantly evolving, and how it's actually, propagating life. I think that is really a vital part, and in every water body around the world, they all change, whether it's a cold water icy fjord, or whether it's temperate Mediterranean Sea, tropical coral reef. They all instantly start to change and evolve, and that process is for me the most exciting, and certainly the most visually stunning. There'll be a process where they'll first get an algae that covers them. That algae will then change color over time. There'll be little calcareous worms and other sort of creatures that build like a skeleton on the surface. From there, you then get some bigger colonies of corals and sponges. You'll get some which are sort of which have stinging cells to them, some that have vibrant colors, some of them breathe, almost they inhale water and exhale water for nutrients. And so you have all these amazing processes happening, and it's never ending. They never reach a final point. Every time I go there, and they're very, very different, and even with each, you could look at, you could just take one, area, 1 foot by 1 foot, and just look at what's going on, and you'll probably see, 50 different species. They'll be warring against each other to colonize more of the surface. They'll have different textures, different colors. So it's really, yeah, really fascinating. And that's just what's happening on the surface. There's also areas for which actually encourage creatures to live. So I'll make homes for sea urchins, for lobsters, for juvenile fish. So those also start to inhabit it. And then there's also the ambient conditions of how deep, will affect what the colors are like, how close to the surface. It will affect how the light dapples across the surface of the piece, whether it's a constant sort of melancholy kind of glow, or if it's more kind of sort of lacy patchwork of light that comes down. So there's a lot that's going on in just on one piece, and again, because it's such a very vast area underwater, I tend to make a lot of pieces to make it so it's has a big home for marine life. And the sculptures I did in Mexico, I think there's almost 800 in total, which took me 5 years to make. So yeah, there's quite a bit that goes into it.
And so, as you talk about this, one of the things that I am thinking about, when you talk about how vast it is, I mean, the oceans cover the vast majority of the earth, and the majority of the oceans are uncharted, unexplored. I mean, I feel like we're discovering new species on a somewhat regular basis as we're starting to explore the oceans more and get into the depths. But it then starts to get me thinking about this sort of tension I feel, because on the one hand, I feel like you're doing work that is absolutely beautiful and amazing. And on the other hand, I am a little bit sort of disappointed because I am not a scuba diver. And I feel like this is something that, I can't see in person. I can see in pictures. And how do you sort of think about the accessibility issues around that, and, how your work can be viewed and appreciated in different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a important thing. And certainly with the work, I do make it as accessible as possible. So they're very, very shallow, the majority of works. You don't necessarily need to scuba dive. You can just snorkel over the top, or go on a glass bottom boat. But it is better. Some of that intricate marine life that I mentioned is nice. It is good when you're scuba diving, I should say, to be able to really see it calmly up close. But I think that's always been my aim, is not to sort of uh, cater for existing scuba divers. I'm much more interested in people that hadn't envisaged the underwater world as a space for art. And I've been fortunate enough to sort of been diving underwater for a long time, but unfortunately during that time, like many places in the world at the moment, it's going through a rapid change, and is degrading very, very quickly. We're fishing, overfishing, throughout the world. Coral reefs are dying back at unprecedented levels from all the ocean acidification, from warming seas, from development. So I really want people to actually get in the ocean, to sort of fall in love with that space, to see how precious it is, to see how valuable it is, so that there's more of a more enforcement of trying to protect it.
Now, if I could just ask you a very basic question, because I'm going to be honest, like I have my BFA, I have my master's in education, and yet somehow I feel like I just don't get a lot of things. Like, I am not an intuitive artist. I am a systems guy. I break things down and have to like analyze the, parts that represent different things. Can you just sort of break us down, like what's happening in a piece visually, like physically, metaphorically, all of that?
Sure, of course. So there's lots of different locations, and I try thematically to make sure that they're very connected to the local cultures and places that they're cited. But obviously, I'm very worried and I feel very strongly about what's happening to the underwater environment. And with that in mind, I tried to build pieces that sort of walk the line between sort of hope and despair. So, on the one hand, I can't be in denial about what's happening, but I think too much negativity can be very detrimental and leave the viewer with a sense of futility and a sense of despair. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So I try to sort of work on two sides of the coin. So I offer pieces that I think are hopeful, that show how humans can have a positive interaction with the natural world, that remind us that we are nature ourselves. We're part of this living environment. We're not. It's not man versus nature. It's a collective thing. And I think that's quite visually, that's quite important to be able to show that that we're interdependent. Our lives are interwoven, and when we harm the environment, we also harm ourselves. But then on the other side, I have days where I'm pretty furious and angry about how our politics are done, how corporations have hijacked many different industries, and how our value systems have been changed by capitalism. So I do pieces that maybe try to call out some of those industries, but I also try to work on ones. And so the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, they were a sort of activism piece that were placed actually in the River Thames outside the Houses of Parliament in the UK. They were quite interesting because they featured actually oil pumps, which you don't get in the UK, you get in America. So the heads of the horses were these nodding donkeys that were extracting from the riverbed, and it featured different business type people on these horses, and the tide came in each day and actually completely drowned them, and then 4 hours later it came down and revealed them. And I thought that was quite an important statement about obviously rising seas and the power of the oceans. And then on the other hand, I've done sort of maybe more inspiring pieces where we've taken corals that have been ripped off the natural reefs by storms and then replanted them into the sort of wings of this underwater sculpture that then starts to actually move and oscillate with the currents and with the waves. And I think that's also a really nice message that how there's this incredible destruction that can take place, but we can regenerate, regrow, and like a sort of phoenix, revitalize things.
Yeah, and I think that sort of resilience and the hope is an important thing to always hold on to, because it is very easy to be overwhelmed by global problems. But as you say, that's not a helpful place to be in, to be just frustrated, angry, or otherwise upset about a problem doesn't solve the problem. And so I really like that you're bringing both into it, that you're not like naively optimistic, but you maintain that optimism in a lot of these pieces. That I think is an important balance.
And it's definitely, I think when you sort of look at it, what's happening on a global stage, it's makes you feel very despairing. But I think when you look at actually small collective action and communities and how, I think if you can just change a small part of your world, it can have a huge effect across, it can spread for sure. So, like I say, I think it's dangerous. It's dangerous to become despairing, but as a community, I think people can make a huge change.
Yeah, I mean, the individual's action is small, but collectively we can do a lot. You're making us aware of and calling out these these problems that we see, but you're also posing some solutions to those problems, helping us to see the beauty and the potential for growth. And I absolutely love that about this work. And I really appreciate that about this, that it's, sculptures that are going underwater that are also supporting life, and it encourages conservation because of the fact that also now probably people aren't going to be fishing those waters where you've installed a giant underwater museum and stuff like that, or at least I would hope not. Now, after just one last short break, I want to get into a little bit of, I guess, a call for action and talk about like what we can do, how we can appreciate the work, and how maybe we can contribute. I'm back with Jason deCaires Taylor, and we've been talking about your work and the environmental impacts of human activity in the world and on our oceans, which I guess is still in the world. But you have been making beautiful installations in various locations all over the place. And you were telling me before that you're working on a new piece. Can you give us a little preview, some insights on what you're currently working on?
Sure. So I try to sort of work on different projects at the same time. So there's the underwater works, which I'm building a piece in Japan, as I mentioned, which are about creating these habitats for marine life. But at the same time, I also like to do some works on land, which are about activism, about calling attention to some of the threats and some of the problems that we're currently facing. I think artists always speak about the times that they're living in, and we're going through a very unstable time at the moment. And so I'm trying to build a piece, and the underwater world is obviously hugely affected by climate change. It's so many scientific studies and statistics that illustrate that. And just from on a personal level, I've been working in many different locations and seen extreme coral bleaching. The Caribbean last year had the warmest temperatures on record. It was so hot. The sea, you went in to cool off, and it didn't transpire. It was boiling hot. And so on the one hand, I do love building these sites that have a positive impact, but I also like to construct works that call attention to some of the people that have had a negative impact. And obviously, one of the major things is the fossil fuel industry. So I'm actually in the process of designing a land-based piece, which is drawing attention to all the different people who have denied and obstructed and distorted the facts around climate change in order to suit their own personal agendas. And I think, when future generations look back at this moment in time, they're all going to be asking the same question: and why didn't we do anything about it? Why did we let this happen? Why did we, let these tipping points occur and destroy so much? And so this piece I'm working on now is about drawing attention to all these different people who have contributed to that. And it's like a sort of it's a golden boat that is on land that is sort of wrecked, and each one of the different people are passengers who have brought around this kind of ecological crisis.
And I always admire an artist who has courage to stand with their convictions and, is not afraid to ruffle feathers, and especially for a good cause. And I am so excited to see this piece along with the others that you've been creating and that you're working on. And for any listeners who want to be a part of that creation, you were saying that, this is one that you are crowdfunding because very obviously, some people who are a part of the problem are probably not going to give you a grant to call them out on it. So for anyone who's interested in that, I'm gonna again refer you to the links in the show notes. Now, if I could end on a bright note, because obviously climate change and the metrics that we're just blowing through are not really happy talk. I do always love to hear from artists about their work. And so what I want to wrap up on is if I could ask you about a specific piece, maybe what's your favorite piece that you've created, your favorite underwater sculpture, or I guess otherwise, but I think the underwater stuff still just blows my mind because I always dreamed of exploring the oceans and going underwater, and the beauty of those pieces has absolutely captivated me. But I'm curious from your standpoint, if I could ask you to pick your favorite baby, what is a piece that you're really proud of, happy with how it came out, that you could share some insights into?
Again, it's quite a difficult question for me because there's a lot of different works in different places, and they're all changed. So, what's most fascinating certainly is the life that grows on it that really, changes dramatically. How I first sort of envisaged it. I mean, there's several that are in Grenada where I first started that have got this incredible golden fire coral that's completely engulfed the pieces. So it's almost like King Midas has come along and touched them because they are completely this beautiful iridescent gold from head to toe, and it's a consistent the way it actually colonizes it sort of spreads like a blanket over, and it has these hairs that are like they're actually stinging cells that give it its name fire coral because when you touch it it hurts.
That seems like an interesting visual metaphor. I mean, the golden fire coral taking over this man-made sculpture that was submerged in Grenada. To help us visualize that, can you tell me, like, what was the piece you're describing there that is submerged? What's the sculpture look like? What was the subject of it?
This was one of the early pieces, and it was a circle of children holding hands underwater, just beneath the surface. And it was sort of about how children absorb their surroundings, how they take on the character and personality and patina of where they live and what their influence and how they grow up. And I thought that was quite interesting because this area where they were was subject to lots of different currents and sunlight and interaction with tourists. And so, it's quite interesting. And the children have all been colonized very differently and grown in different ways. And actually, that piece then went on to inspire another piece. So when I was working in Mexico, I sort of made a piece that was called Man on Fire. And with that, I actually managed to seed some of the fire coral onto it so that I could guarantee that it would colonize. And from those seeds, it then turned him completely gold. And I thought, again, that was quite a good metaphor, obviously from a fossil fuel and warming temperature point of view.
And that's interesting. So when it first happened with the sculpture of the children and the fire coral, you said there were lots of cross currents and different things, and it happened very organically. So that was not an expected or intended patina, if you will, on the sculpture. That just was a fortuitous turn of events. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. Like a lot of it, it's the differences are so slight. You can have one current that passes through that brings certain nutrients from a certain part of the world that will then change how it looks. It's quite amazing underwater. I'm here in the UK at the moment, and I have eels in my local river that have just swum from Brazil across the Atlantic. That's how interconnected everything is. And underwater, there's basically a snow of embryonic material and of nutrients and different matter that's in this water body that when it comes into contact with a stable substrate or a sculpture, then it will then adhere to and start to grow. But it's real pot luck, what will actually sort of rain down and be in the right conditions to then thrive. And it makes a big difference, when there's a nice current, you get all these filter feeding creatures, you get these big sponges that inhale the water, that extract the nutrients. If the temperature's right, you get, these beautiful coral formations. And then on the negative side, if there isn't the right conditions, if there's a lot of sediment or stirred up sand that will scour the sculpture, then you'll get a different. And I've had times where there's been a spike in temperature and a thick blanket algae has just covered all the sculptures and killed everything on them. And then I'll be really depressed. But then a year later, it's gone and something else has taken its place. So it's always evolving.
Now, just to wrap things up, I have a number of listeners who are obviously engaged in the arts, but also we can engage with the arts in different ways. Some are creators themselves, and some are just consumers of the arts. But what thoughts or advice or insights would you share with people to encourage them to be more thoughtful, either on the creative or the consuming end?
Oh, there's so many so many different angles. The more and again, it's really hard not to sort of talk in cliches, but I think I've spent a lot of my career sort of, especially in the beginning, thinking about the end product, thinking, when I get to this point and when I reach this level and when I get to that level and and the older you get, you realize it's just all the process. It's just the actual moment of doing things, and it's a lifelong, or it's a long-term commitment. It's not something that you just reach this level and it clicks and you've made it, and it doesn't work like that. All these things sort of come together, and I've tried lots of different things I've thought are irrelevant, but then when I look at it later on in my career, they were all vital and all played into building on something. And I think it's that journey that's so important, and it's so easy to lose sight of that as you're working.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, because I actually almost take the opposite approach. I always am thinking about like, okay, what's my next goal? How can I keep improving? And I guess you're not really saying to not do that, but just to also appreciate the journey and not be focused exclusively on the product, because the product may change and probably should change, but the process is where we live and how we grow.
Definitely. And I think we look for the end result in everything now. We sort of, it's such a sort of instant culture, so easy, especially now with, all these digital tools that, you can realize things very quickly with. I think you lose sight of that element of discovery, of exploration, of evolution. You sort of, the best ideas always come from, starting off a journey and then making 1,000 decisions along that journey, and then you end up with something unique. Whereas when you try to get to that end goal too quickly, it becomes so generic. You're just taking the same journey that everyone else has taken. I think that's quite important.
It is very, very profound. And also, I have to say, I love talking to artists, not only to get different insights, but it is so satisfying to me that like your words of wisdom to wrap the episode are also like perfectly manifest in the artwork itself, because what you just described is so played out visually in your work that has no end point, because nature grows off of it, and it takes on literally a new life when it's installed underwater. Thank you so much once again, Jason deCaires Taylor. I cannot overstate how much I enjoyed talking to you, learning from you, and seeing your amazing work.
No problem. Thank you again for inviting me on the show.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.